Welcome to Worship with First Church. My name is Holton Jablonski, and it is my great joy and privilege to serve you as your minister. I'm very excited to welcome to today's service two of my incredible summer worship production team. Stefan and Valentin Frank have been working so hard alongside Richard Curzi to bring you these last many summer worship services. They have done a great job, and I am so grateful to them both. It has been a joy to get to know them all. And in the course of our conversation, Stefan mentioned a service they led many years ago, exploring and reckoning with their Nazi heritage. He shared some of the service with me, and as you will see, it is challenging and exquisite, thought-provoking, fascinating, and inspiring. If you are worshiping with small kids, know that a few times some of the realities of the Holocaust are mentioned. You might want to check it out on your own before watching with them. Especially now, this story matters. I'm so grateful that you are here. So welcome. Let us worship together.
Please join me in saying, life is a gift for which we are grateful. We gather in community to celebrate the glories and the mysteries of this great gift.
It's been a prevalent notion, falling sparks, fragments of vessels broken at the creation. And someday, somehow, before the end, a gathering back to home. A messenger from the kingdom arriving at the last moment. But I tell you, there is no such message, no such home. Only the millions of last moments, nothing more. Our history is an aggregate of last moments.
Dona, Nobis, Pacem, Pacem, Dona, Nobis, 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 Pacem.
First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
About 10 years ago, I was sitting in the Jewish temple in Belmont, observing my son Valentin helping his friend Ben with his bar mitzvah by putting back the scrolls into the ark. While I was sitting there among my Jewish friends, joining their celebration about this joyous moment, I reflected a bit on how far I have come in my relationship to both the Jewish people and also to the Holocaust, my native Germany's shameful past. As a backdrop, both of my parents have been born during the Nazi regime. Their parents, my grandparents, were in their 20s and 30s, and both of my granddads served in World War II, and both were captured, one by the Americans, one by the French, and they returned about a year after the war. Ariana's granddads also both served. One served on the Eastern Front, and having enough of it, he deserted and walked home from Russia, while the other one joined the Nazi Party. And one of my uncles, Uncle Arthur, was conscripted by the Hitler Youth to man an anti-aircraft gun at the age of 14 years old in 1944. So what was it like growing up in Germany in my generation? By the age of 10, most Germans have seen countless movies, TV shows, classroom movies, magazine articles, depicting murderous Nazis, piles of corpses, killing machines, and every form of unimaginable cruelty, usually culminating in a visit to the local concentration camp. We had been told about the killing of millions of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, intellectuals, and we were told that the perpetrators were our fellow countrymen, our forefathers, Germans like us, and this mess would be our heritage. So we did learn a lot about the crime, but what did we learn about the perpetrators? They were people like Goebbels and Himmler, an oligarchy of cruel men that played the media and the public opinion like no other, deceiving German voters and hiding their crimes for a long time. At the same time, they used the SS and the Gestapo to threaten the general population into obedience, or at least prevent it from revolution. Of course, we would have wished that the people in the general population could have shown more resistance and heroism. However, according to our parents, this was difficult, since both did not know the depth of the crime, and joining the resistance would be a risk to the family. And everybody in our family were good folks, not Nazis. And even Ariana's grandfather joined the Nazis only in order to get more food for the large family that he had. And what did we learn about the victims, the largest victim group being the Jews? Simply said, everything we learned about the Jews had to do with the Holocaust. Every movie, every article, everything we heard or read about the Jews was set in the Third Reich. And this was not counterbalanced by any real Jews in our community, since understandably there are not many Jews left in Germany. I personally did not get to know a Jewish person really well before I moved to the US at the age of 29. So the only association I had with Jewish people was that they are victims and that they are destined to end up on one of the piles of corpses in the concentration camps. One thing that reflects this more than anything else is the fact that it took both Ariana, my wife, and I 10 years of living in the US before we were no longer nervous when we used the word Jew. Strange as it might sound, but we were far less nervous about using the F word in the wrong context, but using the J word in a way that would not be correct. Saying Jew always made me clench and duck a little. So in summary, I was perfectly able to describe the brutality and the enormity of the crime and the implicit guilt of the German people. But to be honest, I stayed emotionally detached on some level, because neither the Jews nor the Nazis were people like us, and the piles of corpses are just too high to digest. When our family moved to the US, we were invited to our very first American Thanksgiving by a Jewish professor that I worked with. He and his lovely family shared their traditional turkey feast with us in an incredibly warm and loving environment. We had desserts and some wine, and we started singing songs both in Russian and in German. When I mentioned the country Germany in one of the contexts, my professor told me that he would never set foot on German soil, because nearly all of his larger family was killed in German concentration camps. And then he poured me some more wine and taught me another Russian song. Strange as it sounds, this was the first time I connected warmth and love and positivity with the word Jewish, with the Jewish concept. And it was also the first time that I felt a deep emotional sadness and rage about what my forefathers have done to this people. And for the first time, I realized that the Jews in Germany were neighbors and friends of my forefathers, who watched their Jewish neighbors being deported, run to the street on the way to the train station. This is artfully reflected in my most favorite Holocaust memorial called Stolpersteine, or Stumbling Blocks, by Günter Demnig. In about 400 cities in Germany and former Nazi-occupied countries, little blocks are in the sidewalk, and they are inscribed with the name of the Jewish family that lived in the house that is right there, and also their fate. And the stones are half an inch higher than the surrounding, so pedestrians have to circumnavigate them and have a glance on the stones saying which family lived here and what happened to them. At about the same time, I read a book called Aimé and Jaguar by Erika Fischer. This book is about the love affair between an Ariane wife of an SS officer and a Jewish girl from the artsy intellectual hipster scene in Berlin. Jaguar, the Jewish girl, ends up dying in a concentration camp, but the book is much more about her as a positive, energetic, artsy, fun-loving person that just enjoys life, and you invariably fall in love with her, as I did. So this deepened my emotional rage and sadness beyond just the loss of my professor's family or the loss of Jaguar as an individual person, but I just realized how many beautiful people Germany has lost. It might sound petty compared to the human toll, but I also realized how much cultural and how much ideas were lost in Germany, and how much more interesting and fun the country would be today if the Jews would still be around. That rage and sadness also reopened the question about the perpetrators. Who were the people that did these crimes? One quote of the US chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, Robert Jackson, encompasses very much the same experience that I had when I asked myself this question. In his closing remarks in the trial about the top Nazis still alive at that time, he said, quote, "The defendants have been unanimous when pressed in shifting the blame on other men, sometimes on one, sometimes on another, but the names they have repeatedly picked are Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, Goebbels, and Bormann. All of these are dead or missing. No matter how hard we have pressed the defendants on the stand, they have never pointed the finger at a living man as guilty. It is a temptation to ponder the wondrous workings of a fate which has left only the guilty dead and only the innocent alive. It is almost too remarkable. So did I make it too easy on me and blaming these others, these Nazis? One of the defendants sentenced to death in the Nuremberg trials was the governor of the Warsaw Ghetto, Hans Frank. Because we share the same family name, I looked into his life a little bit, and I realized that he not only grew up 15 miles from where I grew up, he looks uncomfortably similar to many of the 220 relatives I have in that area, many of them named Hans, and he even has my hairline. Is he related to me? I'm not sure, because nobody in my family would tell me. This made me remember when I found an old gramophone record in the attic of our house with a Horst Wessel song, which is the Nazis' battle song. When I inquired why this is there, they said, well, the neighbor was a minor Nazi and he was frightened that if they find it in his house, he would get into trouble, so he gave it to us. Gullible young me swallowed this explanation. I never asked, well, if he was a Nazi, why did you cover for him? I never asked, why did you not throw away this trash? And I never asked my neighbor why he was a Nazi, if the story is true at all. And when we dug into Ariana's grandfather's past, the one that joined the Nazi party just to get more food for his family, we found out that he joined the Nazi party in 1932, which was 1 year before Hitler came to power. And he was not just some Nazi in our town, he was one of a handful of Nazis that was pretty prominent proudly cheering when the Jews were led to the street to the deportation. So in other words, it was not them that did that. It was people like us. In the movie Downfall by Bernd Eichinger, made in 2004, the last days in Hitler's bunker are described. In this movie, the architect of the Nazi regime and propaganda minister Goebbels sang his kids a tender lullaby and kissed them goodnight after their last meal. This scene received criticism in German media because it dared to portray a Nazi as a loving family father and tender man. However, I feel that thinking about Goebbels this way is exactly what I owe my legacy as a German and the millions of Jews that my forefathers killed. If I want to extract one positive thing from the Holocaust, it would be to learn how to avoid another one. And in order to do this, I have to accept that my forefathers that did that were loving people that kissed their children goodnight. I have to accept that people from my own family were part of that. I have to accept that people like myself could be involved in something like that. Only then can I truly learn how to prevent another Holocaust. So my grandfather's generation was too ashamed and too afraid of the consequences to really be honest about what they did. They pointed fingers and told lies to the point where they started to believe their own lies. And my parents' generation, they were kids eager to believe that their parents were good and swallowed all the stories being told to them. I myself realized that problem too late, to really talk to my grandparents and to my grandfather, or to Ariana's grandfather, and ask them, why were you in the party? What were you thinking when they paraded the Jews to the streets? Why did you not help them? Which brings me to the famous words of Pastor Niemoller that Karsten read just before. I only recently learned the context of these words. Niemoller actually supported the Nazis and initially helped them. He was all for fighting the communists because the communists were atheists. And he held sermons and preached about how Jews should not play a major role in German society as a punishment for nailing Christ to the cross. And only when the Nazis came after his own Protestant church, he started fighting them and ended in concentration camp. So these words are not the enlightened words of a wise man with a lot of insight. These are actually bitter testimony of a man as guilty as many Germans in these times. So as I wrote this reflection, I wondered what I have learned from this story. To put it very simple, it took me 35 years to learn that Jews and Nazis are people like me. This sounds like a pretty trivial insight. So how does this help me in today's world? Well, if I look at the suffering of the people in this country, for example, the immigrants or people of color, it is important for me to not just see them as victims, not just see immigrants as people that knock on our doors and need help. I need to see them as fully equal to myself. I need to see them as people that I need to be as angry about their kids in cages as I would be about my kids in cages. And I have to welcome them in this country with all their culture, with all their contributions, on equal footing, something that Black Americans in this country never had. So while I do see a lot of positive movement towards that direction, I see much less movements in the direction of humanizing the perpetrators. Modern media has a tendency to dwell on crimes and victims. The emotions that keep people in front of a TV are outrage against the perpetrators and compassion for the victims. So they usually portray perpetrators as monsters if the deeds are monstrous. True monsters not only help rally against this common enemy, rally emotions against this bad person, but they also avoid the uncomfortable question, could I have done something like that? I personally believe if we do not accept that ordinary people like ourselves have done the Holocaust, we have not really learned from it. Germany in the 30s was a very advanced country, well educated, very rich, good communication system, and democracy. And the people that drove Germany to this monstrous crime were people that are very similar in demographic than us sitting here in Belmont. As a German, I don't dare to ask you to think of my grandparents' generation as loving and caring people. This would sound too much like I want to excuse them, even though I'm more critical of them than ever before. However, I do urge you to ask yourself very honestly what it really takes to become a perpetrator. Could you become a perpetrator in the right circumstances, or could you already be part in a system that creates monstrous deeds? When I look at the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Derek Chauvin, I often hear the argument that Derek Chauvin was a bad apple in the police system. However, there's a good chance that Derek Chauvin was a loving family father that sang tender lullabies to his kids. And if I think of him that way, then I ask myself questions that might be much more suited to help with real change than executing deserved punishment on him as an individual. The question I would ask myself are, how could it come to the point that Derek Chauvin overruled his compassion and empathy? What is it in the system that made him think that what he does is the right thing to do? How can we humanize other ethnicities and races in a more effective way so that his empathy cannot be suppressed that way? And there's one question I grapple with a lot is, do I actually do enough to prevent the polarization of our society? Thanks a lot.
Chance might cause itself Hello, First Church community. Nobody is born a bigot. However, nobody is born without the ability to one day become a bigot. I know for a fact that relatives of mine, not distant ones or cousins of cousins, but the majority of my great-grandparents, actual regular human beings, that my parents and grandparents knew intimately, played a part in the atrocities of the Second World War and the horrors that happened during that time. I know that my direct forebears stood at the side of the road as Jews, homosexuals, and others deemed undesirable and inferior were gathered up and sent to die. How does one parse that? Obviously, there is a historical image that we do not want repeated, and thus want to avoid. However, what is the appropriate reaction or thought in that situation is something that eluded me back in the initial iteration of this reflection in 2013, and still has layers for me today. Not out of a need to explain or tell any particular stories. There are people whose lives and histories qualify them far more for that role than me, but because what was clear to me in 2013, and is even more so today, is that the path and choices that my great-grandparents took through their life still exists, and is real, and is scary. I personally think I was born into an interesting generation when it comes to this piece of history, because it'll be right in the middle of my lifetime that the Second World War will pass from being living memory to just history, in the sense that it is past and gone. On February 14th, 2012, an English woman named Florence Green passed away, thus marking the point where no more veterans from the First World War would be able to tell us personally about the events from it. With the end of the Second World War now 75 years ago, this point is rapidly approaching for this era of history as well. For me, this is quite a symbolic change. My dad talked about how there was his grandparents' generation, who would never criticize the Nazis or the events of that era due to having lived it. And then their children, his parents, my grandparents, that would never speak of it out of recency or shame for their parents' actions and experiences. Well, here I am, having never met any of my great-grandparents, but still with direct stories from my grandparents and anecdotes from relatives. Stories of raisin bombers from my grandfather and old memorabilia, certificates, medals, keepsakes, and books. Yet, all this is starting to feel very distant. In history class, there seems to be a bit of a split between the historic and distinctly distant 40s, with their war and strife, and the 50s, which seem to be just around the corner, for where we are now. But does that mean that the history should also be treated in a different way? In his novel Mason and Dixon, Thomas Pynchon writes that history is not chronology, for that belongs to the lawyers, nor is it remembrance, for remembrance belongs to the people. If we accept this and want to truly learn from history, then we need to separate these ideas. Truly examining the history of something means more than praising and remembering the good and shunning the bad. As my dad already stated in his piece, the demonization of evil acts and simply writing them off as evil actions only leads to a kind of mental separation from truly understanding and thus growing from what happened. This sort of thinking is an alluring mental trap that even well-meaning people can often use to obfuscate some harsh realities about the world. An example. If the topic of my relatives' involvement in the war ever came up, I've always been excited to jump at the chance to tell the story of my great-grandfather Henry, my middle namesake, who abandoned the German army on the Russian front and then walked back home to Germany, a journey of over 1,500 miles that involved sneaking past Nazi watchposts and garrisons in order to not get caught. I make sure to emphasize how lucky he was that the war had ended by the time he got home, otherwise he would have most likely been recognized a traitor and killed. I would most certainly not bring up my great-grandfathers who had actually been part of the Nazi Party. I wasn't in denial about it, and I don't think that any of my friends would have thought any differently of me if I told them those stories, but nevertheless, something kept me from doing so. despite the fact that these were people that I'd never met, despite the fact that this was almost not living memory anymore, despite the fact that I was not risking anything in saying so. When I was younger, I told myself that I disliked, maybe even hated my forebears for having been part of that entire era, for having ever given meaning to the word Nazi, for having made it so that every time I told people that I was German, that connection existed. As a child, I found myself thinking, why did that have to happen? I did nothing wrong, so that's an awfully unfair position for me to be in. Of course, nothing I can do can bring back the millions of lives lost for no reason, no matter how much I want to. I can't erase the shame or denial that so many in the generations above me felt, but looking forward now, how can I approach the world in a way that is the most compassionate and proactive? As Pynchon said, the key is not in knowing the facts of the past, as that is simply knowing the chronology, and neither remembering and preserving the past in its glory and shame, as remembrance doesn't lead to understanding, but rather taking the past as history, engaging with it in the present. And this involves not forgiving and humanizing, nor demonizing or hating, but something more active and reflective that I've not yet found a good word for. When I see people protesting the removal of statues or monuments of Confederate figures, and then invoking their pride in their family's history as their reason for not wanting to see them go, I feel an odd sort of kinship with that argument. There exists a cognitive dissonance here between pride in one's family and past and the harsh reality of the abominable things that some of these individuals stood for. The important thing that I take from that is that this dissonance is not something to shy away from or to push you to pick sides. Instead, that feeling, that impulse, is an important reminder that the capacity for evil actions exists in all human beings. And that capacity can be activated by personal choices, life circumstances, and other forces and events that shape our lives. Nobody is born a bigot. However, nobody is born without the ability to one day become a bigot. But alongside the capacity for that, all humans also have the capacity for love, for allyship, for compassion, and for being someone in the world who hinders that capacity for hate to be activated in anyone around us, especially the ones that we love. I have a family history that I am not proud of. I know people in 2020 that I am not proud of. Also in the world, there are causes and movements that require our support to push for what is right and just in the world. I believe that understanding the cognitive dissonances that exist within that, and informing my actions and words with these understandings, is a process that is valuable and important, and key to me playing a part in this interconnected community and country and world. Thank you.
Marching in the light of God.
give thanks for being welcomed into the warm and loving holiday celebration, for old patterns melting. We give thanks for opening to sadness and rage, for stumbling blocks, for remembering. We give thanks for learning how to avoid another one, for the capacity of loving people who kiss their children to embody great evil. We give thanks for being as angry about their kids in cages as our own kids in cages. We give thanks for seeing our place in a system that commits monstrous deeds, for engaging with history in the present. We give thanks for cognitive dissonance, for no one being born a bigot, for no one being born without the capacity to become a bigot. We give thanks for the capacity of love, for allyship, for compassion. We give thanks for the hindering of the capacity of hate. We give thanks for the great-grandson of Nazis, helping to put the Torah back into its holy place at a beloved friend's bar mitzvah. We give thanks for the cycles of history, for learning and growing and making a new way. Amen.
Well, how do you do, young William McBride? Do you mind if I sit here down by your graveside and rest for a while in the warm summer sun? I've been walking all day and I'm nearly done, and I see by your gravestone you were only 19 when you joined the Great Fallen in 1916. Well, I hope you died quick, and I hope you died clean. Or William McBride, was it slow and obscene? Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife slowly? Did the rifles fire o'er you as they lowered you down? Did the bugles sound the last post in chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Did you leave a wife or a sweetheart behind? In some loyal heart are your memories enshrined. And though you died back in 1916, in that loyal heart are you forever 19? Or are you a stranger without even a name, enshrined forever behind glass pane, in an old photograph torn and tattered and stained, and faded to yellow in a brown leather frame? Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife slowly? Did the rifles fire o'er you as they lowered you down? Did the bugles sound the last post in chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Well, the sun's shining now on these great fields of France. The warm breeze blows gently, making red poppies dance. The trenches have vanished long under the plow. No gas, no barbed wire, no guns firing now. But here in this graveyard, it's still no man's land. The countless white crosses in mute witness stand to man's blind indifference to his fellow man. And the whole generation that was butchered and damned, did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife lowly? Did the rifles fire Well, I can't help but wonder, young William McBride, do those who now lie here know why they died? Did you really believe them when they told you the cause? Did you really believe that this war would end war?